ladies and gentlemen, it's Timothy here. Kaladesh has been out for a little while now, and I will be honest straight from the get-go here that I think Kaladesh is a really difficult format to draft. I've had my fair share of 4-0s, 3-0s, and I've also gone 1-3 a couple times, even dropped out of tournaments before from poor showings. And it's a really hard set to evaluate because there's so many different decks, there's so many build-arounds, there's so much going on in the set. And you know, you can have a synergy-based deck, you can have a beatdown deck, you can have a long game control deck, you can have all sorts of things, and they just match up differently against certain things. So your deck may be really good, but just poorly positioned against other decks that people drafted, and you can completely flop with a reasonably strong deck, or you can win with a pretty mediocre deck if you have the right kind of matchups. It's just a really interesting format. I've had a lot of difficulty with it, but I think after having drafted it a good number of times at this point, I can make some pretty firm claims on what I believe the best card in each color are. Now, I did this with Eldritch Moon, and I looked back at how I initially evaluated the colors. These videos, if you've seen them, I tend to pull out the top 4 from each color in both commons and uncommons. So when you see the first slide here, I'll be looking at the green cards, and I'll let you know the 4 cards I picked for the top green commons and the 4 cards I picked for the top green uncommons, and I'll kind of reevaluate what I went over. So having played the format, you have kind of a fresh opinion about a lot of the cards, and it's interesting to look back and see what, you know, I thought was going to be the standout cards and which ones I think I'm still right about and which ones I've completely changed my opinion about. So again, this is completely my opinion. If you disagree, that's fine. Leave a comment about it, but be respectful and keep in mind this is just my thoughts. So if you disagree, go for it. Just again, be constructive, and if you agree, then let me know that too. I really like to hear other people's opinions about the set as well. But jumping into green here, enough of hearing me talk. I've got it set up as 2 cards and then 2 honorable mentions. You can consider the honorable mentions the cards that I'm not really happy to first pick out of a pack, but they are the strongest cards in the colors minus the ones I'd first pick in the back. So we're talking about like your 3rd, 4th pick type cards, not cards that you should expect to wheel very often and things like that. But the first 2 here, Hunt the Weak and Pima Outrider, are the commons in green that I believe are the strongest, or at least believed were the strongest, and we'll see if that still holds up here. Hunt the Weak was a card that's been reprinted a couple of times. It's always been decent in the format, and I still kind of agree with it. Pima Outrider was just a very impressive-looking creature from the get-go, it being a 4/4 trampler for 4 with a little bit of flexibility on that, and it has definitely impressed me. I do think green is the strongest color, and you can see that by having commons at this level. I think it's very, very standout color. It's very strong on curve above what all the other colors are capable of doing, minus a couple of the artifacts. So my pick for strongest color at the common level at least is green, and I do determine power level of colors based on the commons in the set, and to some extent the uncommons, but not the rares. But anyway, I believe Hunt the Weak is still one of the strongest green commons in this set. However, Pima Outrider, I think Thrive in Rhino is the type of card I would probably pick over Pima Outrider, and the reason is not because there's that much of a power level difference. Obviously, Pima Outrider is in a vacuum a little bit of a stronger card, but Thrive in Rhino is so good on turn 3. It helps fuel other energies. It helps fuel other rhinos. It's good in multiples. It's above the cut for pretty much any other 3-drop common in this set when it attacks. It attacks essentially as a 3/4. And can grow from there. And the reason I pick it over Pima Outrider is simply because it's a 3-drop instead of a 4-drop. This is a highly aggressive format. You want to be hitting your curve. I've noticed if you miss your 3-drop or you miss your 4-drop or 2-drop, you probably lose the game. It's that consistent that if your opponent's curving out and you miss part of your early curve, you are way, way behind. And Thrive in Rhino helps you get ahead on board. It's also exceptionally good on the play. Being on the play is huge in this format, and maybe I'll talk about that in a different video, but I do give Thrive and Rhino like a tiny little nudge over Pima Outrider, even though looking at them side by side in a pack, if I had to pick one, it would be pretty much determined by what my need for 3-drops or 4-drops is. And obviously Hunt the Week being another 4-drop is just a corner case. I'll mention that a couple times in this video, that there are a lot of 4-drops, and a lot of times I will hedge in the favor of a lower mana creature beating out a higher mana creature or something like that, simply because it's really easy to find 4-drops. It's a little more difficult to find really quality 3-drops like Thrive and Rhino. For the 2 honorable mentions, I had originally mentioned Thrive and Rhino and Riparian Tiger as what I thought would be the next runner-ups, meaning I would take Hunt the Week and Pima Outrider first, but I would be very happy to see Riparian Tiger and Thrive and Rhino later in the pack. Obviously, I've bumped up Thrive and Rhino, and I am going to stick with Riparian Tiger here. I think the card does perform well. I noticed it's a little bit polarized, not a lot, but I think everybody agrees Riparian Tiger is a solid card, but I actually think it's a great card for a common. It attacks as a 6/6 trampler, and it can do that consistently in the right kind of deck. And a 4/4 trample for 5 is a decent base as is. And Thrive and Rhino, I'm just going to replace that with Pima Outrider. So a lot of people might disagree. Pima Outrider might be better than Hunt the Week in most cases, but green does lack removal, and that's why I still give the nod to Hunt the Week being one of the best commons, because if you're playing a creature-heavy deck, you do want a few pieces of removal, and there is a point in the pack where you'd have to take something like Hunt the Week over Pima Outrider. Tiger is a nice top end. It does a better job at being Cow Prowler than Cow Prowler does, which is a pretty close to unplayable card. But I'm going to stick with these cards for my commons here. So not really adding any new cards to the list, just kind of maneuvering with what I already had. And you'll see that for a couple other things here. Moving into uncommons, I will say green has a lot of quality uncommons, so much so that I had trouble picking a 4th and 5th card here. I could have easily picked about 6 uncommons, but the 2 cards I originally mentioned were Servant of the Conduit and Nature's Way. I thought Servant of the Conduit would be great simply because it's a mana dork. And mana dorks at 2 mana are usually pretty good. They're usually really high picks in limited if you look at older examples. Things like Leaf Gilder from Origins, or the elk, I forget its name, from Theros or Born of the Gods or whatever set it was in. They're usually really good limited cards because they let you get ahead on curve. And like I mentioned, being on curve is great, so being ahead on curve has to be awesome. Not to mention it fixes your colors, it adds energy, it does a lot of things for a 2-mana creature. And Nature's Way is everything I said about Hunt the Week, but pretty much better. Nature's Way is ridiculous. There's no way that's coming off of this list. It is one of the reasons I move into green. If I see it even second pick, I'll take it early and hope to draft green. Do I stick with these cards? Yes, I do stick with these as the top 2 uncommons in green, even though I will admit some of the other uncommons are pretty close. I had mentioned Arborback Stomper and Armorcraft Judge as kind of the runner-up here, meaning I would take Servant of the Conduit or Nature's Way over one of these other 2 cards if I saw them for perhaps my second pick. Arborback Stomper is another card that I've heard a little bit of contention on. Nobody thinks it's bad, but there are some people who kind of waver on how good it is. I think it's amazing, so I'm going to give Arborback Stomper the okay here. Whenever this card comes to me and I'm in green, I'm extremely happy. I haven't played in GP Atlanta and made it to day 2 having one of these in my deck. I can confirm like that 5 life gain really matters in this set. Gaining life is huge, and adding to the board with a creature this big while also gaining life is really, really big. It's almost as swingy as something like Essence Extraction in black, where you're affecting the board and also buffering your life total, which is great. Armorcraft Judge is still an amazing card. It gets a little bit worse outside of the right kind of decks. It's not hard to draft a deck that can take advantage of Armorcraft Judge, since there are a lot of common ways in pretty much every color to put 1/1 counters on creatures, but sometimes it can be a dud, even though never actually that bad as just a hill giant. I am going to push it out here for another card that I neglected to mention the first time around, and that is Long Tusk Cub. This card has just impressed me time and time again. If you miss your curve and your opponent plays this on turn 2, you're dead. Long Tusk Cub will kill you single-handedly. It functions a lot like the renowned creatures from Origins, where they hit you, they get bigger, but this one threatens to keep doing it over and over again, and it's insanely strong. Not to mention it is an energy sink, which is not very common in this set, where you can just dump excess energy into it to make a big creature. So this comes down on turn 2 as a very, very strong threat that must be dealt with pretty much immediately, and then in the late game can come down and kind of soak up any extra energy you have to make a sizable threat in the late game. And then that combat trigger is just really good, feeling your other cards, feeling itself, so on and so forth. So if this ever gets a clean hit on turn 2, it can spiral out of control and can almost put your opponent down single-handedly. Also, just being a forerunner in one of the strongest decks, which in my opinion is red-green energy in limited. It is a very high pick and could perhaps nudge out something like Servant of the Conduit. Like I said, I'd probably take Servant of the Conduit over it a little more often, but it is really close between these 4 cards here. Moving right along to red, I do think red is a really strong color. It has very good removal, but it does lack a little bit in the creature department, at least as far as the commons are concerned. And you'll see what I mean here. The 2 commons I had originally mentioned were Welding Sparks and Reckless Weaver, right? Welding Sparks is definitely on this list, and I do think it is the best red common. I don't think a lot of people are going to disagree with that. It's very efficient, being at in minimum 3 damage for 3 mana at instant speed, and a lot of times even more than that. So it takes out things way above 3 mana for very little investment, and just works and does its job very well. Reckless Fireweaver I had speculated on because it's reminiscent of cards like Thermo Alchemist, which were quite good and limited. I do think the card is quite good. It's very good in red-black and red, well, I guess just red-black, but any artifact-based red deck for the most part, red-black being kind of the cornerstone or the key color combination to take advantage of artifacts like this. But I don't think Reckless Fireweaver is one of the best commons anymore, even though it does a pretty good job at what it does. It's just not as abusable as something like Thermo Alchemist is in its own set. So I'm going to nudge Reckless Fireweaver off this list in favor of Chandra's Pyrohelix, which I've been quite impressed with. Chandra's Pyrohelix is not the type of card that I'd really be happy with drafting as a first pick out of a pack, but it is the type of card that I do take as a sign that red is open. It does enough damage with just being able to deal 2 damage that sometimes it burns a player out, sometimes it kills an actual creature, and sometimes it kills multiple creatures. It deals with servos very nicely in addition to getting an extra little bit of value, and it does a much better job than the red Puzzle Knot, which is a strictly sideboard card, whereas Chandra's Pyrohelix is a perfectly main board card. The honorable mentions I'd picked out when the set was first spoiled were the Pyrohelix itself and Spontaneous Artist. Obviously, Pyrohelix is going to be surpassed by another card here since I've bumped Pyrohelix up on the list, but I do believe Spontaneous Artist deserves this spot on the list. If you watch my video of 10 underrated cards that you should be drafting in Kaladesh, Spontaneous Artist was one of the cards I have mentioned. It's not amazing by any means. Again, red has kind of mediocre cards at common quality compared to the rest of the colors, but it is very good at what it does. There are a lot of haste creatures in the format, and being able to continuously apply pressure is really, really huge. Spontaneous Artist is very flexible with its ability, which is an ability that is not typically known for being flexible, meaning that you can either play it as just a 4-mana 3/3 haste, or you can store up the energy to make your other threats hasty as the game goes on. So it is a threat your opponent has to be aware of, while not necessarily being a must-kill creature. Pyrohelix is going to be bumped up in favor of Salivating Gremlins. Again, this wasn't like a card I was dying to have on this list, but if you compare it to all the other commons in red, it just beats them out by a tiny little bit, and I think it beats Fireweaver quite a bit too. Having the same kind of ability, meaning when artifacts come down, it's adding damage to the board, but Gremlins tends to do more damage than the Fireweaver does from what I've noticed. It's pretty good in multiples. It's very good if you have multiple artifacts, and it is the type of card you might actively be looking for in a draft if you know you're playing something like red-black artifact. So don't pick Salivating Gremlins highly, but once you know you're kind of in the market for artifact-based creatures, you should be looking for Salivating Gremlins before you look for cards like Fireweaver, in my opinion, of course. Uncommons, again, there are a lot of really quality uncommons in the set, and that does not fall short here for red. So the two uncommons I had mentioned here were Harnessed Lightning and Brazen Scourge. Harnessed Lightning is definitely staying on this list as probably, in my opinion, the best red uncommon in the set. Probably very close to the best uncommon in the set. Close to other cards I'll mention later on in this video, but it has the power level of cards like Nature's Way at instant speed, being able to scale from the early game to the late game, depending on what kind of deck you're playing, and just being a clean, efficient answer to many creatures in the format. Brazen Scourge, while being a card I quite like, I found it's actually difficult to cast double red on turn 3 sometimes, which really mitigates its power. Not to mention there are a lot of other hasty threats and 3-power creatures that come down on turn 2 or 3, which mitigates its superiority in this set. Looking at the card in a vacuum, it looks amazing. 3 mana, 3/3 haste is an extremely strong card for an uncommon, but with all the things I just mentioned, its power level is definitely bumped down just a little bit. That's not to say the card is bad. It is quite good, but it's not as good as I thought it would be. So I'm going to cross that card off this list completely in favor of Furious Reprisal, which in my opinion is just amazing. The card was one I was skeptical about during spoiler season. It looks like it might not deal enough damage, but it does its job very well. It often kills 2 creatures, and sometimes if it only kills a creature and nugs your opponent for 2, you're quite happy with that as well. So Furious Reprisal gets one of these lists, just like Home and Lightning, or Harnessed Lightning, I should say. Home and Lightning is a completely different card. Furious Reprisal is the type of card that I see around pick number 3 or 4 in the first pack, and it's a sign that red is open. The other 2 uncommons I had mentioned, obviously Furious Reprisal was a card that stood out, so it was on my honorable mentions list, and Incendiary Sabotage, which is a card that has really not panned out the way I thought it would. Sometimes it's great, but honestly, its problem is that in a red deck, most of your creatures will die to Incendiary Sabotage, so it's hard to set it up in a favorable position. Not to mention you have to sacrifice an artifact, so you're probably losing more than your opponents in most cases. It's a card that in the words of a friend of mine, it is a good red card for non-red decks. And sometimes as a sideboard card, it does its job really well and can help you out of a tight spot, but I don't think it deserves to be on the list anymore. So I'm going to mention Malphus Doorbuster, a card I've been able to play with very few times, but have played against enough to know it's quite good. The fact that this comes down and makes energy and can make certain creatures unblockable, or unable to block, I should say, makes this card a real threat, and really mitigates the 4/2 for 4 that I don't particularly like most of the time, meaning you can kind of set this creature up to at least trade with something favorable rather than just being chumped off by your opponent's 2-drop. Aether Torch Renegade is another card at uncommon that could have easily been replaced by a couple other cards on this list, with Brazen Scourge being very close in power level, I think. The Renegade just does its job very well. I think the part that really gets me here is the pinging ability. In other words, the tap to deal 1 to a creature, because it is quite efficient in this format. It makes combat a nightmare for your opponent, knowing that you can deal an extra damage and trade up on your creatures more often than you'd normally be able to. It makes a ton of energy, so it's really good in those kinds of decks, and every now and then you get to blast your opponent for 6 off the ability, even though I'll be honest, I haven't seen that ability come up very often. The only real downside is that it's a 1/2 for 3, which are not stats you'll really be getting ahead with, but if your opponent isn't playing an extremely aggressive deck, you should be able to make up for the lost time by taking advantage of this guy's abilities. Alright, so I will mention for black that I felt like my analysis of black was quite good, and as usual, black is kind of the premier color for removal, so removal usually takes a high spot over black creatures, and that is the case with Kaladesh as well, so I am giving a lot of checks to myself here, pat on the back, I guess, but if you disagree, please let me know. The 2 commons I had originally mentioned were Die Young and Tidy Conclusion, and spoiler alert, I'm sticking with those 2. I think black does have a good number of quality commons, but I think Die Young and Tidy Conclusion are just very, very good, and cards you're actively seeking in when you know that you're playing black. They are the type of cards that fit very well in decks together, with Tidy Conclusion being a clean answer to late game creatures and Die Young being a pretty efficient answer to most early game creatures. And Die Young is especially impressive in its ability to take out bigger creatures later in the game sometimes. Tidy Conclusion does the same thing with having the extra life gain actually be relevant sometimes, and I like both these cards quite a bit. Willing to play multiple copies of each of them in my black decks. The honorable mentions I had originally mentioned were Lawless Broker and Subtle Strike. Subtle Strike is an A+ in my opinion as far as combat tricks are concerned. The card is a huge blowout against people who aren't expecting it, and for people who are expecting it, there's not a lot they can do about it. It's just a huge power toughness swing in the fact that it can target multiple different creatures. The fact that there's a 1/1 counter theme in certain colors here really gives this card a huge edge when it comes to playing a black deck. The thing about black is the creatures are pretty small or all around the same power toughness range, with kind of 3/3 being like the average, I would say. Subtle Strike really puts it over the top, letting you get in with certain creatures while also having some long stand-in power in that 1/1 counter, which is an effect that would normally just be +1/+1 for the turn, but it does have a long-standing effect there. Lawless Broker, while I don't think is necessarily a bad card, is certainly not better than Dund Operative, and I was kind of waffling between Dund Operative and Foundry Screecher here, but Screecher really falls short sometimes with its 1 toughness. Dund Operative is decent as a 2-drop, and very, very good as a 2-drop followed up by an artifact or preceded by an artifact. 3/2 Death Touch, 4/2 mana is quite good. I like it especially in vehicle-based decks because it can crew almost any vehicle on its own, with the vehicle giving it +1 power and up to the crew 3 ability. I like this card quite a bit. I've played decks with multiples, and I've been impressed pretty much any time I've drawn it. It plays offense and defense very well, which is a lot for a 2-drop at a common. Uncommon cards I had originally mentioned include Essence Extraction and Aetherborn Marauder. Essence Extraction is by far the best black uncommon, being extremely good, and like I mentioned earlier, life gain is very relevant in this format. This could be the card that makes it or breaks it in a very aggro versus aggro matchup, or if you're playing black-red kind of controlling and you need to get to the late game and establish a board presence, Essence Extraction will give you the time to do that. So the card is great. I've started off a lot of drafts by taking this card over the rares or other uncommons in the pack. Aetherborn Marauder is also a card I'm going to keep on this list, although I will say it's pretty close to replaceable with the other 2 uncommons in the honorable mention slot, which I'll go ahead and mention now are Weaponcraft Enthusiast and Underhanded Designs, and I'm going to keep both those cards there. I will admit Oval Chase Dragster was a card that's gone a little bit up for me, but I don't think it's better than any of these other cards. There is an argument for saying that Underhanded Designs is a little bit more build around, and that if you don't have a lot of artifacts, it's not particularly great, but that's the same for Oval Chase Dragster. If you only reanimate Oval Chase Dragster 1 time throughout a game and you have to pay 4 more mana to cast it, it's not impressive, it's just a decent card. And the same goes for Underhanded Designs. Given the 2 options, if I knew I was really stretching artifacts for one of those cards, I'd rather have Underhanded Designs, which has a neat little drain ability attached to a creature removal spell. With that being said, I do think our Aetherborn Marauder is better than both those cards, even though a lot of times I just see it played as a 2/2 lifelink flyer for 4. I think that's a perfectly reasonable card on its own, with a lot of upside if you ever move a counter. Weaponcraft Enthusiast is a card that doesn't look like it's amazing, but does just enough at its power level and its mana cost to justify its spot on this list. It's especially good in white-black, where you can reanimate it with certain cards like Fortuitous Find, or you can blink it with cards like Aviary Mechanic and Acrobatic Maneuver. So I like the card quite a bit, and I'm really happy to take it. Not to mention that I've seen it go very, very late in packs, so people aren't as high up on it as I would imagine they should be. Alright, moving into blue, the elephant in the room. I will admit here, while I say green is the best color as far as commons and uncommons go, I do believe blue is quite a bit worse than all of the other colors. Not that it's necessarily bad, it's not to the extent of Triple Shadows where it's unplayable, but it is very apparent that blue does not have the pure power level of the other colors and needs to find a way to win through card advantage and board presence and things like that. So, as far as blue commons go, Gearseeker Serpent and Aether Theorist are cards I'm going to keep at the top here. Both these cards are very, very good as far as commons go. With Gearseeker Serpent, Stretching the abilities of a common. This card looks like a 7-drop. I've seen it cast for 7, maybe 10% of the time I've seen these cards cast. If you ever cast it for 6, that's still a good card, and anything below that is quite absurd. The card gets through board stalls on its own. It closes out games, which is something blue has trouble doing sometimes, and its affinity ability is really, really good for a common card. Aether Theorist is a little innocuous looking, but does its job extremely well, scrying multiple times throughout a game, giving you card advantage and card selection, which is a lot to ask for a common. We've seen cards like this before in Geist of the Archives and Sigiled Starfish, but those are normally uncommons and don't have any power to boot. The fact that this has 1 power does make it a pretty good blocker on top of that 3 toughness, and this essentially equates to drawing extra cards throughout the course of the game if you're filtering cards you don't need to the bottom of your deck. For commons, I had mentioned Malfunction and Weldfast Wingsmith. Malfunction is going to stay on this list because it is probably the premier blue removal spell. It is a little bit wonky at 4 mana, so it's not amazing compared to something like Revoke Privileges, which does essentially the same thing. It's also possible to get around it with cards like Ornamental Courage or whatever the green spell is called, but it does its job pretty well. It takes down big creatures, it takes down artifacts, mainly vehicles, and functions very, very well, or malfunctions well, perhaps I should say. Weldfast Wingsmith is a card I've been unimpressed with. While flying is very important in the set, there are other flyers at the same kind of mana cost or before the mana cost, before 4 mana, that do its job a little bit better. So I'm replacing this card with Select for Inspection. And Select for Inspection is not an impressively strong card, and you can see what I mean by blue having kind of a low power level. Even cards like Windrake are a little bit worse in this format than they normally would be. So I'm putting this card in here because it does its job well. It bounces a creature either defensively or on offense. There are times where your opponent tries to remove an attacking creature, and bouncing it back to your hand means you get to replay it. There are also some pretty neat things you can do, like crew a value creature, or use a value creature to crew a vehicle, which causes it to tap, and then use Select for Inspection to bounce that creature, replay it, so on and so forth, get value off of it. Plus the Scry one on top is really nice. Again, not an impressively strong card, not a card I would ever first pick out of a pack, but definitely a little bit worse than Malfunction and the other 2 commons here, and just kind of signifying how weak blue is in the common slot. Blue has some pretty strong uncommons, but also has a lot more build around uncommons and cards that have just kind of not impressed me throughout this format. The 2 cards I had originally mentioned as perhaps strongest uncommons are Shrewd Negotiation and Longfin Skywell. One of these cards is staying, and that is Shrewd Negotiation. Every time I've seen an opponent play this card against me, it wins them the game. They take the biggest creature, they give me a Prism Array, or not a Prism Array, but a Prismatic, whatever it's called, you know what I'm talking about, and or a Servo or a Puzzle Knot or something like that, and they just steal my best creature. It's borderline Confiscation Coup power level, and Confiscation Coup, in my opinion, is a bomb rare. Longfin Skywell, however, is a card that has definitely not impressed me. Being unable to block ground creatures is a huge bane in this format when you have cards like Renegade Freighter attacking the same turn that Longfin Skywell comes down. If this is your 4-drop and you don't have very much before that, you are in a lot of trouble. The card is not unplayable. It's still quite good, as it deals 4 damage in the air, which can close out a game very quickly. It's just very, very good on the play and extremely worse on the draw, where to the point where I've actually started boarding this card out and would probably not play multiples of it in most of my decks. So instead of Longfin Skywell, I'm going to mention Aether Meltdown, which is a card I hadn't even picked up on this entire list. Spoiler alert. Aether Meltdown is great. It does basically the same job as Malfunction. Yes, it leaves your opponent with a blocker, but it does it much earlier. It does it at instant speed, and it gives you that energy to boot, which is something that blue can use quite nicely, with cards like Aether Theorist taking advantage of energy. So I like Aether Meltdown. Again, blue is not drafted very highly, so you can get cards like this very late in a draft, and it should be a sign that blue is pretty open in your table. Honorable mentions, again, I kind of had to speculate here because blue had a lot of kind of tricky cards to evaluate. Era of Innovation was a card that I just kind of put on this list because I didn't really know what else to mention, but I don't think the card is that amazing. Sometimes there's a bit of a payoff where you get to draw 3 cards, but that's usually because you're playing a deck that can amass energy through other means, not necessarily because you're paying that extra mana for artifacts and artificers. So Era of Innovation, not impressed with it. Glimmer of Genius, I will still give the okay to here because it does its job very nicely. Scry 2, Draw 2 is basically read the bones without taking damage, and doing it at instant speed with the extra 2 energy definitely justifies the extra mana that you have to spend. Glimmer of Genius, I see wheel very often in drafts, and I have no idea why. The card is very good as far as card selection goes. So what's going to nudge out Era of Innovation here? That will be Experimental Aviator. And I know this might be a little bit of a controversial card because a lot of people don't like this card, but damn am I impressed with this card. It comes down, it makes 3 bodies, all of which fly, all of which combo very well with cards like Chief of the Foundry and Inspired Charge. And in a pinch, if you are behind, it stabilizes quite nicely. I really, really like the card. The more artifact synergies you have, the better. Sometimes it's a little bit of a dud where you have to just chump block, but if that's what you're forced into, you could do worse than chump blocking with 3 creatures rather than 1. Alright, the last color here, and then I will update my picks for artifacts as well. The white commons, and white has very strong commons and uncommons, being very close to green for what I believe is the strongest color. So I would put white as second here in my opinion. The 2 strongest white commons in my opinion are Revoke Privileges and Glint Sleeve Artisan, which are cards I'm not going to budge on. I think both of these are very, very strong. While I don't think Glint Sleeve Artisan is pushing the boundaries of first pickables, I think Revoke Privileges is a first pickable card from a pack that does not have particularly great rares or uncommons in it. Revoke Privileges is a pacifism type effect, and I have noticed that inability to crew vehicles tacked onto it is relevant during a lot of games. So I think these cards are great. I would play any number of copies of them throughout most of my white decks, and I've been very impressed with the way they play out. Honorable mentions went to Impeccable Timing and Propeller Pioneer. I'm going to keep Impeccable Timing on here, even though there are some times where it's a little inefficient, and sometimes you need to be able to remove a creature that's not attacking or blocking, so it doesn't do its job. It does what it does quite nicely. It gives white a very early game answer to some of these hasty creatures that usually have around 3 toughness, and it's quite efficient at killing off other creatures. Even if you have to 2 for 1 yourself, it's worth noting that it deals damage rather than just trying to destroy something like a card like Puncture and Light does. Propeller Pioneer, while still a very good card, is not something I'm actively looking for, and it's because of the 4 mana cost. White has a lot of 4 mana cards, just like the rest of the colors do. So instead of Propeller Pioneer, I'd rather take something like Aviary Mechanic. This is, again, another innocuous looking card. It doesn't look like it's super impressive, but it plays extremely well in the format, letting you bounce certain creatures and get extra value off of them. Cards like the Prism, which let you draw cards, cards with Fabricate, cards that have been enchanted with cards like Revoke Privileges and Malfunction. It does quite a bit in the format, and at the very least, if you have to play it on turn 2 without any value, that's pretty decent as well. White uncommons, I think there are 2 shoe-in cards that I picked for best uncommons, and there's no way they're coming off the list. They're both extremely good. Aerial Responder has been a card I've lost to a couple times that I had no business losing, simply because the Vigilance and Lifelink is enough of a life swing over the course of both players' turns that it can single-handedly get you back in a game you're losing while also pushing you ahead towards a win. And Skywhaler Shot, I think, is even better than that, with Skywhaler Shot being my pick for probably the best uncommon in this entire set, even over cards like Essence Extraction and Homing Lightning. I think the card is fantastic. I'm very happy to see it despite it not coming very often. There's no way this card ever survives past 2nd or 3rd pick because people are willing to splash in this format for the card. It just turns out that being able to destroy a big creature is something much, much rarer in this set than being able to destroy a little creature, and the Scry 1 tacked onto it is just icing on the cake. Honorable mentions originally went to Fairgrounds Warden and Visionary Augmenter. Again, nobody's arguing that Fairgrounds Warden is a good card. It's definitely a good card, but I think people evaluate cards like this much higher than they should, and that is because it's easy to remove creatures in this format. You are going to kill a 3 toughness creature, and when you do, you get your card back, so you're essentially 2 for 1 in your opponent. Well, 1 for 1 in really, a removal spell for a creature or something like that. Where Fairgrounds Warden is good is when you're either ahead or when you top deck it when players don't have any action left in their hands. Obviously, the card's going to come down and exile a creature a good number of the times, but when I've played it, I've usually opted to exile a token if I could, simply because I know at some point it's going to be removed from the table. Having only 1 power and 3 toughness means that it dies to a lot of removal in this set. So I don't think the card is busted, and I certainly wouldn't take it over either of the other 2 white uncommons above it, but it is going to stay on the list. Visionary Augmenter, again, while being a card I really, really like, is going to get pushed out for Wisp Weaver Angel. If I saw these 2 cards side by side, it would depend on my curve considerations. If I think I could fit another 6-drop in my deck, or if I didn't have a very high top end for my white deck, I would probably take the Angel over the Visionary, and if I was looking for another 4-drop specifically, I would take the Visionary. But Whisperweave Angel is everything good about Aviary Mechanic, but better on a flyer and a late game creature. So everything I just said about that 2-drop stands true about this 6-drop, and a 4/4 flyer is pretty strong in this format, even if it costs you 6 mana. Alright, and then finally to colorless cards, and then I'll leave you be for the day. Again, thanks for watching. Anyway, the 2 commons here that I had mentioned were Skyskiff and Renegade Freighter, and I was just taking them at face value. It was very hard to evaluate how vehicles would play out in this format without having actually played it at all. Having played it, I do think vehicles are quite good. There are some that are pretty bad, and while I will admit cards like Skyskiff have gone down in value, cards like Renegade Freighter have gone up in value. I do believe, and I agree with a lot of people who say this, I think Renegade Freighter is the #1 best common in the entire set, simply because it's colorless, it deals massive amounts of damage, and you'll put it in pretty much any deck that runs a good number of creatures. A lot of games are decided just by a Freighter on turn 3, and if you can't answer it, you're SOL. And if you can answer it, you usually have to use a premium removal spell. You have to top decked your artifact removal, or you often have to trade multiple creatures for it, which is insane for a 3-drop common to be that much of a threat. So Renegade Freighter stays on the list permanently, will not be nudged down at all. Skyskiff is going to get booted down in place of Prophetic Prism. Not to say Skyskiff is bad, but I do think Prophetic Prism has played out quite impressively in this format. Again, it's a type of card where you look at it and you wonder why it's so powerful, but it's also the type of card that really early in the format, you could pick up as many of these as you wanted because no one would take them. And at this point in the format, you would be lucky to get one 5th or 6th pick because people take them very highly now. But it replaces itself, it fixes your mana, and the second ability is very relevant besides mana fixing, or besides splashing, because there are a lot of cards in this set that require 2 of a certain mana, like double blue or double green, and this helps you cast your spells quite nicely. So Prophetic Prism is a card that combos very well with a lot of other things while also making your mana nicer and replacing itself, doing a lot for a common here. Honorable mentions went to Aradara Express and Snare Thopter. Obviously, I was cheating on Snare Thopter because that is not an uncommon. But Aradara Express, not a card I like very much, but I do think I would take it over Skyskiff a lot of times. That's not true. I would probably take Skyskiff over Aradara Express. Again, the big train is not the best card in the world. Sometimes Crew 4 is too much. Sometimes a 5-mana artifact doesn't do anything right away. But when it attacks as an 8/6 menace, when you come down and you're able to give this haste, when there's a board stall and you have the Aradara Express, you are able to push in wins that much easier. Snare Thopter obviously didn't deserve to be on this list at all, so I am going to still keep Skyskiff on the list because I do think the card plays nicely. It just does not play as a 2-mana 2/3 flyer, which is what it looks like. Crew 1 is an actual cost. Even 1 power worth of creatures is still tapping down something, and I think that that needs to be taken into consideration when people evaluate Skyskiff. Moving on to uncommons here, Snarethopter may or may not show up on this list. The 2 uncommons I mentioned for the best ones, and again, it's hard to evaluate uncommons more or less because they fit into every deck, so they're just usually pretty universally good, but some of them stand out above the others. With these cards being 2 on the list, Chief of the Foundry is a card I will play in any deck. I don't think I've ever cut the card from my list. I don't think I ever would. It plays very nicely with Fabricate, Thopters, other artifact creatures, basically anything you can think of in the set. The card was tailor-made for the set. It does its job exceptionally well, and Lords are pretty good and limited, especially when you can cast them pretty reliably on turn 3 and follow up with a pretty big artifact creature. Filigree Familiar, spoiler alert, will still be on the list, but is going to get bumped down in favor of Bomat Bizarre Barge, which is a card I had mentioned in the honorable mentions. Again, I had put it a little bit lower despite looking like a very good card, more or less because I didn't know how vehicles were going to play out. But this card cantrips, and even though Crew 3 is a significant amount more than 1 or 2, it's not that often that Bizarre Barge is just sitting there not doing anything. It will get in for damage. It's on the power level of something like Cultivator's Caravan, while being a little tiny bit worse, I think. It does its job exceptionally well as a beater, as a blocker, and as a cantrip. So I like the card quite a bit, and I'm almost never passing it out of any given pack. With that being said, the 2 honorable mentions were originally Ballista Charger and Bizarre Barge. Bizarre Barge is going to stay on the list, but Filigree Familiar will take the spot of the Ballista Charger. Not saying Ballista Charger's bad. Again, it's a Crew 3 vehicle with a very potent effect and an extremely big body, but Filigree Familiar is super efficient and still deserves a spot on this list. What's going to take Bizarre Barge's spot? Well, Snarethopter. Since I cheated the first time around, there you go. I think Snarethopter is great. A 3/2 flyer for 4 is already a good card. Giving it haste is just icing on the cake again. And like I've said, haste is very prevalent in this format, even though the creatures have low toughness. Putting it on a flyer and putting it in colorless makes it an exceptionally strong card. So Snarethopter has been a first pick for me multiple times, and I've actually played decks with multiple Snarethopters and been very impressed with the way it plays out. Alright, so thank you guys for watching, listening to me speak for a very long time about Kaladesh cards. I am interested in hearing what you guys think, so if you think my picks are way off, then let me know, and if you think my picks are really good, then let me know that as well. If you agree, disagree, just be constructive about it and be polite in the comments. So I would love to hear from you guys and see what you guys think are the best commons and uncommons in this set, now that Kaladesh has been out for a good while. Any other feedback, I'm open to it. And until then, I will see you guys next time. My name's Timothy. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and see y'all later.